2004, a park ranger named Takeshi Hayano walked into Aokigahara Forest to begin his weekly patrol. He had been walking these trails for 16 years, recovering what the forest collected, documenting what others refused to acknowledge. On that particular morning, he found something that broke him. Not a body. He had found hundreds of those over his career and had learned to process the grief with professional detachment. What Takeshi found that morning was a tape recorder hanging from a branch by a length of red string. The tape inside was still running. It had been recording for approximately 7 hours. When Takeshi pressed play, he heard the voice of a young woman speaking calmly, deliberately, describing something moving through the trees around her. Something she could see but could not identify. Something that was whispering to her in a voice she recognized. The voice of her mother. Her mother who had died in the same forest 11 years earlier. The recording lasted 43 minutes before the woman's voice stopped, but the tape continued for another 6 hours, capturing sounds that Takeshi later described to researchers as impossible. Sounds that did not belong to any animal documented in the region. Sounds that resembled human speech played backward, fragmented and rearranged into patterns that almost formed words but never quite crossed the threshold of comprehension. And beneath those sounds, barely audible, a rhythmic pulse that audio analysts would later confirm was not mechanical, not biological, not anything they could categorize within existing scientific frameworks. Takeshi Hayano turned the recording over to local authorities. They thanked him, filed it, and never mentioned it again. But Takeshi kept a copy. He kept copies of everything the forest gave him, because after 16 years of walking beneath those trees, he understood something that the authorities refused to accept. Aokigahara was not simply a place where desperate people went to end their lives. It was something far older, far more intentional, and far more aware than any forest had a right to be. The people who entered those woods did not always do so by choice. Some of them were invited. Tonight, I am going to tell you the darkest secret of Japan's suicide forest. Not the statistics you have read in articles. Not the sensationalized accounts that treat human tragedy as entertainment. I have no interest in exploiting the suffering of those who have been lost among those trees. What I am going to share with you is something different. Something that researchers, historians, and Japanese authorities have known for decades but have deliberately kept from public discussion. Something that transforms Aokigahara from a tragic destination into something far more disturbing. A place that feeds, a place that remembers, a place that has been doing what it does for far longer than anyone wants to admit. I have spent 14 months investigating this story. I have traveled to Japan twice, interviewed retired rangers, consulted with Shinto priests who maintain shrines at the forest's edge, and obtained documents from archives that required permissions I am still not entirely sure I should have been granted. What I found challenged everything I thought I understood about this place, and it began with a question that no one seemed willing to answer. Why this forest? Japan has thousands of forests. Many are more remote, more isolated, more accessible to those seeking solitude in their darkest moments. Yet Aokigahara draws them. Year after year, decade after decade, century after century. The authorities post signs along the trails begging visitors to reconsider, to call helpline numbers, to think of their families. Rangers like Takeshi patrol weekly, sometimes daily, searching for those who can still be saved. And yet they come. They walk past the signs. They ignore the ribbons tied to branches by previous visitors marking paths back to the world of the living. They push deeper into the trees, into the silence, into a darkness that has nothing to do with the canopy overhead, and everything to do with what waits beneath the volcanic rock floor of a forest that has been collecting the dead for over 1,000 years. The answer to that question, why this forest, is the secret I am here to share. And the answer is not what you expect. Aokigahara sits at the northwestern base of Mount Fuji, spread across approximately 14 square miles of hardened lava from an eruption that occurred in 864 AD. The lava flow destroyed villages, reshaped the landscape, and created a terrain so twisted and porous that the forest which eventually grew upon it developed characteristics found nowhere else on Earth. The trees grow from rock rather than soil. Their roots spread across volcanic stone in tangled networks that make navigation nearly impossible once you leave the marked trails. The rock beneath your feet is hollow in places, riddled with caves and cavities formed by ancient gas pockets, creating a landscape that absorbs sound in ways that visitors describe as deeply unsettling. When you stand in the heart of Aokigahara, you hear nothing. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through branches. The silence is so complete that visitors report hearing their own blood moving through their veins, their own heartbeats amplified by the absence of competing sound, until the rhythm becomes oppressive, alien, as if the beating belongs to something else. Compasses malfunction within the forest due to magnetic iron deposits in the volcanic rock. GPS signals weaken and disappear. Cellular reception drops to nothing within minutes of leaving the main trails. Aokigahara does not simply feel like a place cut off from the modern world. It is a place cut off from the modern world, operating by rules that predate technology, predate recorded history, predate the very concept of rules. But the silence is not the forest's most disturbing feature. The silence is merely the invitation. What follows the silence is what keeps researchers awake at night, and what drove Takeshi Hayano to retire in 2009 after 21 years of service, unable to spend another day beneath those trees without questioning his own sanity. The forest moves. Not in the way that all forests move, branches swaying in wind, roots growing incrementally through stone over decades. Aokigahara moves with intention. Rangers who have patrolled the same trails for years report that the paths change. Landmarks shift position. Trees that stood in one location during a morning patrol appear in different configurations by afternoon. The Japanese Forestry Agency has officially attributed these reports to disorientation caused by the dense, uniform canopy and the lack of distinguishing features within the forest interior. But Takeshi Hayano told me something different during our second interview, something he had never shared publicly, something that made him lean across the table and lower his voice as if the forest might somehow hear him from 6,000 miles away. Takeshi told me that in his 21 years of patrolling Aokigahara, he discovered 47 caves that were not on any geological survey, not small crevices or shallow indentations in volcanic rock. Full caves, some extending hundreds of feet into the earth, some containing chambers large enough to stand in, some descending at angles that suggested they reached depths far below the lava field's foundation. Every time Takeshi reported a new cave to the forestry agency, a team would be dispatched to document and map it. And every time that team arrived at the coordinates Takeshi provided, the cave was gone. The rock face was smooth, unbroken, showing no evidence that an opening had ever existed. Takeshi began marking the caves himself, photographing them, measuring their dimensions, recording their precise GPS coordinates on the rare occasions when his equipment functioned. He compiled a private archive spanning nearly 2 decades. When he showed me this archive in his home outside Tokyo, spreading photographs across his kitchen table with hands that trembled slightly despite his efforts to control them, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. The caves were not random. When Takeshi plotted their locations on a topographic map of Aokigahara, they formed a pattern, a spiral, starting at the forest's outer edge and winding inward toward a central point that Takeshi had identified but never reached. A point deep within the forest's interior where the trees grew so dense that sunlight had not touched the ground in centuries. A point where, according to historical records I later obtained from a Shinto shrine archive, something was buried during the eruption of 864 AD. Something that was not supposed to be uncovered. Something that the forest had been growing to protect for over 1,000 years. The historical records were fragmentary, written in a form of classical Japanese that required specialized translation. What they described was not the eruption itself, but the events that preceded it. In the months before Mount Fuji unleashed the lava flow that would create Aokigahara's foundation, the villages surrounding the mountain experienced phenomena that the writers struggled to articulate using the language and concepts available to them. People disappeared from their homes at night, returning days later with no memory of where they had been but carrying knowledge they should not have possessed, knowledge of deaths that had not yet occurred, knowledge of disasters that would not happen for years, knowledge of names and faces belonging to people who would not be born for generations. The village priests recognized these symptoms. They had encountered them before, in stories passed down through oral traditions stretching back to periods that the historical record cannot verify. They knew what was responsible, and they knew that the only solution was burial. The records describe a ceremony conducted on the slopes of Mount Fuji by priests from 7 different shrines. The ceremony lasted 3 days and 3 nights. What they buried, the records do not specify directly. They refer to it only as the voice beneath the mountain, a presence that had existed in the volcanic caves beneath Fuji for longer than human memory could account for. The priests did not claim to have killed it. They did not claim to have defeated it. They claimed only to have silenced it, to have bound it beneath stone and prayer, to have placed it in a sleep so deep that it would take a catastrophic event to disturb it. The eruption of 864 AD was that catastrophic event. When the lava flowed across the landscape, burying villages and reshaping the terrain, it did not simply create new geological features. According to the shrine records, it cracked the seal. The binding that the priests had constructed was damaged, not destroyed, but compromised enough that the voice beneath the mountain began whispering again. Faintly at first, so faintly that only the most sensitive individuals could perceive it. But consistently, persistently, year after year, century after century, whispering from beneath the hardened lava, from within the caves that appeared and disappeared like breathing, from the roots of trees that grew in patterns no botanist could explain. The forest was not a natural response to the lava flow. The forest was a response to what lay beneath it. Aokigahara grew because something needed it to grow. Something needed the silence, the isolation, the magnetic interference that kept modern technology from functioning properly. Something needed a place where human beings could become lost, could become separated from the world that protected them, could become vulnerable to a voice that had been perfecting its whisper for over 1,000 years. This is what Takeshi Hayano came to understand during his 2 decades in Aokigahara. This is what drove him from the forest and into a quiet retirement that he fills with rituals designed to keep the voice from following him home. He burns incense at sunrise and sunset. He maintains a small shrine in his garden that he tends with an intensity bordering on obsession. And he never, under any circumstances, enters any forest after dark. Not Aokigahara, not any forest. Because Takeshi believes that once the voice learns your name, it does not forget. It simply waits for the trees to be close enough to carry its whisper to your ears. I asked Takeshi about the people he had found during his career. Not the bodies, the living ones. The ones he had reached in time, the ones he had talked back from the edge, the ones he had guided out of the forest and delivered to medical professionals who treated their despair with medications and therapy and the well-meaning interventions of modern psychiatry. I asked him what those people said about why they had entered Aokigahara. His answer unsettled me more than anything else I encountered during my 14 months of research. He told me that the ones who could speak, the ones who had not yet descended so far into the forest's influence that language had abandoned them, almost always said the same thing. They did not say they had come to die. They said they had been called. They described hearing something in the days and weeks before their journey, a sound that existed just below the threshold of conscious perception, a frequency that vibrated in the spaces between thoughts, filling them with an overwhelming certainty that something in Aokigahara needed them. Not wanted them, needed them. As if their presence in the forest would complete something, would satisfy a requirement that they could not articulate but felt with every cell of their being. Takeishi saved over 500 people during his career. He is celebrated for this, rightly so, but he told me something that no interviewer had ever asked him to elaborate on. Of those 500 people, approximately 130 returned to Aokigahara within a year. Some were saved again. Some were not. The ones who returned told Takeishi that the voice had not stopped calling them after they left the forest. It had grown louder. It had grown more specific. It had begun speaking in the voices of people they loved, people they had lost, people whose absence created a gravity so powerful that eventually resistance became impossible. This pattern, the calling, the return, the escalating specificity of the voice, matches descriptions found in historical records spanning centuries. The shrine archives I obtained contain accounts from the Edo period, the Meiji era, and even earlier, all describing the same phenomenon with remarkable consistency. People drawn to the slopes of Mount Fuji by a presence that spoke in stolen voices. People who entered the forests and caves and never returned. People who did return but brought something back with them, a shadow behind their eyes, a distance in their speech, a tendency to stand at windows after midnight and stare toward the mountain with expressions that their families described as longing. The Shinto priests I interviewed at a shrine near Aokigahara's eastern boundary were reluctant to discuss the forest's history. They were polite but firm in their deflections, steering conversations toward general spiritual principles and away from the specific questions I was asking. But one priest, an elderly man who had maintained the shrine for over 40 years, agreed to speak with me privately after the others had retired for the evening. He spoke on the condition that I would not use his name, and I will honor that agreement. He told me that the shrine's primary purpose was not to serve the local community, although it did so faithfully. The shrine's primary purpose was containment. Every day, at sunrise and sunset, the priests performed rituals that had been passed down through an unbroken chain of succession stretching back to the years immediately following the 864 eruption. These rituals were not symbolic. They were functional. They were designed to reinforce the seal, to maintain the binding that kept the voice beneath the mountain in a state of diminished influence. Without these rituals, the priest told me, the forest would become something far worse than what it already was. I asked him what could be worse than what Aokigahara had already become, a place synonymous with death, a forest that consumed dozens of lives every year, a wound in the landscape that never healed. He looked at me with eyes that held a sadness so deep it seemed geological, layered, and compressed by decades of proximity to something he understood far better than he wished to. He told me that the deaths were a symptom, not the disease. The people who died in Aokigahara were not the voice's ultimate purpose. They were sustenance. Each life that ended beneath those trees fed something, strengthened something, moved something closer to a threshold that the original priests had calculated would take approximately 1,200 years to reach. I did the math in my head before he finished speaking. The eruption occurred in 864 AD. 1,200 years from 864 AD is 2064, 40 years from now. The priest saw the calculation register on my face and nodded slowly. Then he said something that I have not been able to stop thinking about since I left Japan. He said the calculation assumed the rituals would continue uninterrupted. He said that in recent years, the number of young priests willing to dedicate their lives to maintaining the shrine had declined significantly. He said that the chain of succession, unbroken for over 1,000 years, was in danger of breaking within the next generation. And he said that if the rituals stopped, the timeline would accelerate dramatically. Not decades, months, perhaps weeks. I left the shrine that evening with a weight in my chest that I have not been able to shake. The priest's words followed me down the mountain path, through the quiet streets of the nearest town, into a hotel room where I sat for hours reviewing my notes and trying to convince myself that what I had heard was the superstitious anxiety of an old man who had spent too many years too close to a place saturated with death. But my notes told a different story. My research told a different story. And the recording that Takeshi Hayano had given me, the one from 2004, the one with the young woman's voice and the impossible sounds that followed her silence, told a different story that I could not ignore no matter how desperately I wanted to. I played the recording again that night in my hotel room. I had listened to it dozens of times during my research, focusing on the woman's descriptions of what she saw moving through the trees, analyzing the background sounds, mapping the audio frequencies against known environmental signatures. But that night, sitting alone in a room with thin walls and thinner curtains, I heard something I had missed on every previous listening. Beneath the woman's voice, beneath the impossible sounds that filled the forest after she stopped speaking, beneath the rhythmic pulse that analysts could not categorize, there was another layer, a layer so faint that it required absolute silence to perceive. I pressed my headphones tighter against my ears and closed my eyes. The sound emerged slowly, like something surfacing from deep water. It was a voice, not the woman's voice, not the backward speech fragments that occupied the middle frequencies. This was something else entirely. Something speaking clearly, calmly, in modern Japanese, from a distance that the microphone should not have been able to capture. I sent the recording to a translator I trusted. She called me back within the hour. Her voice was different, strained. She told me what the voice was saying. It was reading names. A continuous, unhurried recitation of names, one after another, without pause, without repetition, without any indication of beginning or end. My translator had recognized 3 of the names. They belonged to people who had been reported missing in Aokigahara in the years following the recording. People who had disappeared after 2004. People whose names could not have been on a recording made before their deaths. I am going to let that settle for a moment. A recording made in 2004 contained the names of people who would not enter Aokigahara for years. Names spoken by a voice emanating from within a forest that should not have known they existed. Names recited with the patient precision of someone reading from a list that had been prepared long in advance. The list, I need to tell you about the list. During my second trip to Japan, I obtained access to a document that the Japanese authorities have never acknowledged publicly. It was provided to me by a retired detective named Hiroshi Yamamoto, who had spent 15 years investigating disappearances in and around Aokigahara before his sudden resignation in 2017. Hiroshi had experienced something during his final investigation that shattered his professional composure and drove him from a career he had loved with a devotion bordering on religious. In the autumn of 2016, Hiroshi was assigned to investigate a cluster of disappearances that differed from the typical pattern. 5 people had vanished from Aokigahara within a single week. This was unusual but not unprecedented. What made these disappearances unique was that none of the 5 individuals had any known reason to visit the forest. They were not depressed. They were not in crisis. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives who had, without warning or explanation, left their homes, traveled to Aokigahara, entered the forest, and vanished. Hiroshi investigated their backgrounds exhaustively. He interviewed families, friends, employers, and medical professionals. He examined phone records, internet histories, financial transactions, and social media accounts. He found nothing connecting the 5 individuals to each other or to Aokigahara. They ranged in age from 23 to 67. They lived in different cities. They worked in different industries. They had never met, never communicated, never crossed paths in any way that Hiroshi could identify. But there was one commonality, one detail so subtle that Hiroshi nearly missed it entirely. Each of the 5 individuals had visited a doctor in the weeks before their disappearance complaining of the same symptom. They were hearing something, a low-frequency hum that no one else could detect, a sound that disrupted their sleep, that interfered with their concentration, that gradually consumed their attention until it became the only thing they could focus on. Medical examinations found nothing wrong with any of them. Hearing tests produced normal results. Brain scans showed no abnormalities. The hum was dismissed as tinnitus, stress-related auditory disturbance, nothing that warranted serious concern. But Hiroshi recognized the symptom. He had read about it in case files stretching back decades. The hum was always the first sign, the first indication that the voice had selected someone, the first whisper in a conversation that would escalate over days and weeks until the selected individual could hear nothing else, could think about nothing else, could do nothing except follow the sound to its source. Hiroshi tracked the 5 missing individuals into the forest using dogs, thermal imaging equipment, and a team of experienced rangers who knew Aokigahara's terrain intimately. They followed trails that led deeper than standard search patterns usually reached, pushing into sections of the forest where the trees grew so thick that movement required constant negotiation with branches and roots that seemed to resist their passage. The dogs became increasingly agitated the deeper they went, whining and pulling at their leads, refusing to advance beyond a perimeter that the handlers could not identify, but the animals clearly perceived. At the point where the dogs refused to continue, Hiroshi made a decision that would cost him his career and very nearly his sanity. He ordered his team to wait while he continued alone. He told them he would be gone no more than 2 hours. He was gone for 11. What Hiroshi experienced during those 11 hours was documented in a private report that he wrote over 3 consecutive days following his return. He typed it himself, refusing any assistance, keeping the document on a standalone computer that was never connected to any network. He printed a single copy, placed it in a sealed envelope, and stored it in a location that he revealed to me only after I had signed an agreement that I would not publish the full document during his lifetime. What I can share is a summary of its contents, and that summary is more than enough. Hiroshi walked for approximately 40 minutes before reaching a part of the forest he had never seen despite 15 years of investigations in Aokigahara. The trees here were different, older. Their trunks were wider than any recorded specimen in the forest, their bark so dark it appeared almost black, their roots rising from volcanic rock in configurations that Hiroshi described as resembling hands. Not approximately resembling hands. Precisely resembling hands, with defined fingers and knuckles and the suggestion of tension, as if the roots were pressing upward from beneath the stone rather than growing outward across its surface. The silence here was different too, not the absorbed silence of the outer forest, where sound was swallowed and dissolved. This was a pressurized silence, a silence with weight and direction, pressing against Hiroshi's eardrums from the inside as if his own body was trying to expel something that had entered through his hearing. He described feeling the silence as a physical presence, something that moved with him, adjusted to his movements, maintained a consistent proximity that felt deliberate. Then he found the clearing. Aokigahara does not have clearings. The canopy is too dense, the trees too close together, the volcanic rock too inhospitable to the open ground that clearings require. But in the heart of that ancient section of forest, Hiroshi found a space approximately 30 feet in diameter where no trees grew, where the volcanic rock was smooth and flat and almost polished, where the sky was visible overhead in a perfect circle that framed clouds moving in a direction that contradicted the wind he could feel against his skin. In the center of the clearing was a depression in the rock, shallow, perhaps 6 inches deep, perfectly circular, approximately 4 feet in diameter. Its edges were too regular to be natural. Someone had carved this depression into volcanic rock that had been cooling and hardening for over 1,000 years. And within the depression, arranged with a precision that made Hiroshi's hands tremble as he photographed them, were objects. Personal objects, a wallet, a watch, a mobile phone, a child's shoe, a wedding ring still attached to a finger bone that the rock had somehow preserved in perfect condition, a notebook filled with handwriting in multiple languages, a compass whose needle spun continuously without settling, a tape recorder, different from the one Takeshi had found years earlier, but identical in its placement, hanging from a branch above the depression by a length of red string, still running, still recording. Its counter indicating it had been operating for far longer than its battery capacity should have allowed. Hiroshi documented everything. He photographed the clearing, the depression, the objects within it, the trees at the clearing's edge with their impossible root formations. He reached for the tape recorder and stopped himself at the last moment, his hand hovering inches from the device, held back by an instinct he could not rationalize but trusted completely. Instead, he simply listened. The tape recorder was not recording silence. Even from a distance of several feet, Hiroshi could hear something emerging from its small speaker. The same backward speech fragments that analysts had identified in the 2004 recording. The same rhythmic pulse beneath the human sounds. And beneath that, the voice. Calm and unhurried and utterly certain of itself, reading from its endless list of names. Hiroshi stood at the edge of that clearing for a long time. He did not enter it. Every instinct he had developed over 15 years of investigating Aokigahara screamed at him to maintain the distance between himself and that shallow depression in the rock, to treat the clearing's boundary as a threshold that should not be crossed. He trusted those instincts. He had learned to trust them in a forest where conventional reason regularly failed. But while he stood there, something changed. The voice on the tape recorder shifted. It had been reading names in a continuous stream, one after another, without variation or emphasis. Now it paused, a pause so sudden and complete that the silence following it felt like a held breath. And then the voice spoke again in a tone that was different from its previous recitation. Deliberate, personal, direct. It spoke Hiroshi's name. He ran. He told me this without embarrassment, without the defensive justifications that people typically offer when admitting to fear. He simply said that he ran, that he did not stop running until he reached his team, that the 11 hours he had been gone felt like 40 minutes from the inside and like a lifetime from the outside. His team told him that they had tried to follow him after 2 hours, but had found themselves walking in circles, always returning to the point where the dogs had stopped, unable to advance regardless of the direction they chose. When Hiroshi returned to police headquarters and reviewed the photographs he had taken in the clearing, he found that every image was corrupted, not deleted, not overexposed, corrupted in a specific way that his department's technology team described as unlike any file corruption they had encountered. The image data was present but rearranged, as if the pixels of each photograph had been deliberately scrambled after the pictures were taken. His department's best analysts spent 3 weeks attempting to reconstruct the images and produced only fragments, pieces of root formations, sections of polished rock, the edge of a depression in volcanic stone, and in one partially recovered image in the upper right corner, something that should not have been in any of his photographs because he had not photographed it, and it had not been there when he was in the forest. A figure standing at the clearing's edge, tall, thin, dressed in clothing that the image resolution was too degraded to identify clearly, but its posture was unmistakable. It was not standing still. Even in a static photograph, something about the way it held itself suggested movement, suggested approach, suggested that when Hiroshi had been standing at that clearing's boundary listening to the tape recorder speak his name, he had not been alone. Hiroshi resigned from the police department 3 months after his investigation. His resignation letter cited personal reasons. The actual reason was simpler and more devastating. After returning from Aokigahara, Hiroshi began hearing the hum, the same low frequency that the 5 missing individuals had complained of to their doctors in the weeks before they disappeared. The sound that was always the first sign. The first whisper in a conversation that would escalate until it consumed everything else. Hiroshi fought it. He fought it with rituals borrowed from the Shinto priests, with distance maintained between himself and any forest, with a discipline that impressed even Takeshi Hayano when the 2 men eventually connected and began exchanging information. But fighting the hum required his complete attention, every hour of every day, leaving nothing for a career, for relationships, for the ordinary maintenance of a human life. So Hiroshi traded his career for his sanity, and considered it a reasonable exchange. When I asked him if the hum had stopped, he looked at me for a long moment before answering. He said it had not stopped. It had never stopped. It had been 3 years since his resignation, and the hum was still there, still constant, still pulling his attention toward a forest that he had sworn never to enter again. But he had learned to live alongside it, to acknowledge its presence without surrendering to its direction. He had learned, he told me, to hear the voice without listening to it. I asked him how. He pointed to a small shrine in the corner of his apartment, maintained with the same obsessive care as Takeshi's garden shrine. Incense, offerings, photographs of living people he loved, arranged to face outward toward the room, away from the direction of the mountain. A reminder, he said, of what the voice wanted him to forget, that he belonged to the living world, that the forest's invitation was not a gift but a consumption, that whatever waited in the clearing at Aokigahara's heart did not want his death. It wanted something far more valuable and far more permanent. It wanted his awareness, his attention, his consciousness, redirected from the world of the living toward whatever existed beneath that polished volcanic rock, feeding the presence that had been whispering for over 1,000 years, adding his perception to the collection of perceptions it had been accumulating since 864 AD, since the eruption cracked the seal, since the forest began growing in configurations that served purposes no botanist or geologist or psychologist had ever been willing to acknowledge. Hiroshi told me one final thing before I left his apartment that evening. He told me about the names on the list. The names that the voice recited endlessly from tape recorders hung in trees, and from the darkness of caves that appeared and vanished like breathing. He told me that during his investigation, before his photographs were corrupted, before the voice spoke his name, before the hum colonized his hearing and refused to leave, he had counted the names he could hear on the recording. He counted for as long as he could bear to listen. In approximately 15 minutes of concentrated attention, he counted over 300 names. He cross-referenced those names against missing persons databases, death records, and historical archives spanning multiple centuries. What he found destroyed his last hope that Aokigahara could be explained through conventional means. The names were not limited to people who had disappeared in the forest. They included people who had never visited Aokigahara, people who lived in other countries, people who were still alive, people who, as far as Hiroshi could determine, had no connection to Japan, to Mount Fuji, to the forest, or to each other. The list was not a record of victims. It was a record of selections, future selections, names chosen by whatever intelligence resided beneath that volcanic stone, written into a sequence that it was working through with the patience of something that measured time in centuries rather than years. Hiroshi found his own name on that list. He found Takeshi Hayano's name. He found the names of the 5 missing individuals whose disappearance he had been investigating. And he found names that belonged to people who would not be born for years, names attached to dates so far in the future that the very concept of their eventual existence seemed abstract. The list extended forward in time with the same confidence it extended backward. Whatever was compiling it did not distinguish between past and future. It treated both as equally accessible, equally certain, equally consumed. This is the darkest secret of Aokigahara, not that people go there to die, not that the forest is haunted by the spirits of the departed, not that something supernatural lurks among its ancient trees. The darkest secret is that Aokigahara is not passive. It is not a stage upon which human tragedy plays out. It is an active participant. It selects. It calls. It draws specific individuals toward itself using a voice calibrated to exploit their deepest vulnerabilities, their most profound losses, their most desperate need for connection with something beyond the silence of grief. And it has been growing stronger. The priest at the Eastern Shrine told me that the rituals were weakening. Takeshi Hayano told me that the bodies he found during his final years were located deeper in the forest than ever before, as if the presence was pulling people closer to the clearing at its center, closer to the depression in the volcanic rock, closer to the threshold between what we understand and what we cannot survive understanding. Hiroshi told me that the hum in his ears had grown louder in recent months, more insistent, more specific, as if the voice was no longer content to whisper and was preparing to speak at full volume for the first time in over a millennium. I returned home from Japan with boxes of notes, hours of recorded interviews, copies of documents that challenged my understanding of what places can become when they are inhabited by something patient enough to wait 1,000 years for its plans to reach fruition. I have spent months organizing this material, verifying claims, cross-referencing accounts, and building the narrative that you have just heard. And throughout that process, throughout every late night spent reviewing evidence, and every early morning spent staring at photographs of tangled roots that look too much like reaching hands, I have been unable to escape a single thought. The eruption was in 864 AD. The priests calculated 1,200 years. That brings us to 2064, 40 years from now. A single generation. One break in the chain of succession at a shrine that fewer and fewer young priests are willing to maintain. One missed ritual. One morning when the incense is not lit and the prayers are not spoken and the seal cracks a fraction wider than it has ever cracked before. What happens then is something that the shrine records describe in language I initially dismissed as metaphorical, but have since come to suspect is terrifyingly literal. The records say the voice will stop whispering. The records say the forest will stop growing. The records say the caves will stop appearing and disappearing because they will all open simultaneously. Every one of the 47 passages that Takeshi Hayano documented over 21 years, every entrance to the spiral that winds inward toward the center, toward the clearing, toward the depression in the rock where something has been collecting fragments of human consciousness for over 1,000 years. And the records say that what rises from beneath that stone will not need to call anyone. It will not need to whisper. It will not need to select names from a list or generate frequencies that pull at vulnerable minds across oceans and continents. Because when the seal breaks completely, the boundary between the forest and the rest of the world will cease to exist. Aokigahara will not be a place you can avoid by not visiting Japan. It will be everywhere, every forest, every shadow beneath every tree in every country on earth. Every silence that settles over every room at 3 in the morning when the world holds its breath and something listens from just beyond the edge of perception. I do not know if I believe this. I do not know if the shrine records are prophecy or mythology or the anxious projections of priests who have spent too many centuries standing guard against something they have never seen clearly. But I know that Takeshi Hayano believes it. I know that Hiroshi Yamamoto believes it. I know that every Shinto priest at that eastern shrine believes it with a conviction that transforms their daily rituals from religious observance into desperate, essential maintenance of a barrier between humanity and something that has been waiting beneath volcanic rock since before recorded history began. And I know one more thing, something I have not shared until now because admitting it forces me to confront implications I am not prepared to fully accept. Since returning from Japan, I have been hearing something, a low-frequency hum that my doctor cannot explain, a sound that exists just below the threshold of conscious perception, that surfaces in quiet moments, in the spaces between thoughts, in the darkness of my bedroom at 3 in the morning when I lie awake and listen to something that might be my own heartbeat and might be something else entirely. I tell myself it is tinnitus. I tell myself it is stress. I tell myself that spending 14 months investigating a forest that allegedly calls to people has simply made me hyper-aware of ambient sounds that were always there. I tell myself these things because the alternative is acknowledging that the voice has learned my name, that the list includes everyone who gets close enough to listen. that the forest does not distinguish between those who enter its boundaries and those who merely open their ears to its story. If this video has stayed with you, if you feel something resonating in the silence of whatever room you are sitting in right now, if you catch yourself straining to hear something just beyond the edge of audibility, then you understand why this story needed to be told. Not as entertainment, not as sensation, but as a warning. Aokigahara is listening. It has always been listening. And the more people who learn its secret, the more names appear on its list. Subscribe to this channel, not because I want your attention, but because there is more to uncover, more forests, more shrines, more seals that are weakening while the world looks away. I will keep investigating, I will keep documenting, and I will keep sharing what I find, even as the hum grows louder, even as the silence in my room takes on a weight and a presence that I cannot explain. Even as I lie awake at night wondering whether the sound I hear is my own heartbeat or something beneath volcanic rock 6,000 miles away, breathing in rhythm with my own breath, patient and ancient and utterly certain that eventually, inevitably, I will listen. They all listen eventually.